Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you all for being here. We are live on our first day of programming for 1455's third annual Summerfest. It's already been action-packed, full of unbelievable content. And I just couldn't be more giddy and proud that we've got more coming tonight. We've got more coming right now, and we've got a lot more coming tomorrow and Saturday. But let's stay in the present. I am absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to be joined by this young man who I'll introduce in a moment. It's an honor to have an opportunity to talk about storytelling and how the craft and discipline of narrative has informed Dax's career and life. So let me introduce him and we'll get right into it. Dax-Devlon Ross is the author of 5 books, and his journalism has been featured in, among others, Time Magazine, The Guardian, The New York Times, Virginia Quarterly Review, The Washington Post Magazine, and other national publications. He won the National Association of Black Journalists Investigative Reporting Award for his coverage of jury exclusion in North Carolina courts, and is currently a Puffin Writing Fellow at Type Media Center. A New York City teaching fellow turned nonprofit executive, Dax is now a principal at the social impact consultancies Dax-Dev and Third Settlements, both of which focus on designing disruptive strategies to generate equity in workplaces and education spaces alike. Dax received his doctorate from George Washington University and currently resides in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Alana, and their young daughter, Ella. He's recently published Letters to My White Male Friends, which actually will be the focus of 1455's monthly author series in August. We are going to talk about this book tonight, but just mentally note that we're going to be doing a deep dive into this book next month. Dax, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Oh man, this is a pleasure. You know, what the audience doesn't know is that they were like, you know, the stars were aligned, and while we met each other sort of late in the game, it was enough time to make something happen, and you made it happen, and I appreciate that. So I'm really happy to be here tonight and have this conversation.
Well, I told you at the time, and I'm happy to say it to the world because it's the truth. We were in crunch time, and you know, my people, which means my bosses, were going to beat me for getting sessions in late. But when we met and I saw your information and we talked, I said, this has to happen. So I couldn't be more happy and grateful that we were able to make it happen. So yeah, there's no question that you need to be a part of this. And in fact, that's actually a good way to kind of introduce what I hope we're going to talk about tonight, which is I've talked a bit about how this festival only 2 years ago was called the 1455 Summer Literary Festival, which was accurate on many levels, but we have since gotten bigger and I think better. And more specifically, the 1455 Festival has become a genuine celebration of storytelling. And when people say, oh, what does that mean? We mean we want to look at what does storytelling mean? Where does it apply, both in the academic and the artistic and the business fields? What do storytellers do and how do they do it? Is it just people that write books, or is it people that use their platforms or even just their brand to affect change? So once we start digging into what storytelling means, we start talking about the real power of narrative and how it's used in society. And that's why, again, I'm tremendously humbled that we're going to benefit from the wisdom of your experience and really suss out what do we really mean when we talk about narrative when it gets down to brass tacks. So I would love you to start, Dax, for starters, just saying, how do you define storytelling, especially how it relates to you and the work you've done, both professionally and artistically?
Yeah. It's funny, like I had, you gave me an opportunity to have a preview of some of the questions, and I decided I didn't want to let myself ruminate them too hard. I want to kind of be in the moment and respond. This morning I actually had an opportunity to, and so in my work with clients, I do work that is often really investigatory inside organizations. That will look like I do survey work, I do focus group work sometimes, and we then put together what's called a findings report. And I often sometimes forget that when I'm writing a 25, 30-page report, that's writing too. And that in many respects, what I'm doing is I'm helping an organization understand itself better through a lens of both like of insider outsider, and also through the voices of their own people. So these findings report that I will deliver will be intentionally structured as a story, and as a story of who you are in this time. And it's going to be a story told to you through your people, through the voices of the people who work in this place, who live this and embody this experience that you have. And hopefully by holding that mirror up to you, you'll be able to begin to understand where you need to go, where the gaps are, where you might want to, where you're succeeding and where you're not actually living up to the things you want to live up to. So in that context, as a way to, and I only share that because that's the fresh thing that's happening right now. It's something I did yesterday, and actually I'm going to be working with the same team tomorrow, this organization tomorrow, to deliver this, do a sort of debrief of that report. It's, even for me, what I'm learning is that the ability to express through narrative form can continuously take on new forms if you allow it to. When I was a younger person, I actually came to writing, and I was very I was a purist in the sense that like story had to look a certain way, had to take a certain form and otherwise it wasn't legitimate. One of the things I've become more appreciative of, and I know we're going to talk about later, is people who are really good at a Twitter thread and being able to use that particular medium in order to like tell a story in a way that is powerful. That is a skill, that is a gift, that is an ability, that is narrative. They've taken something that wasn't supposed to be that actually, and they found some way to build narrative into it. So I think it is ultimately our ability to harness whatever the resource and modality that we're working with to build human connection. And human connection is fundamentally an exchange of experience, and experience is most readily understood through story. And the telling of that can happen and show up in a variety of ways. So I allow myself, and I hope others do, be expansive in what that means and what that looks like.
So, and I'm imagining, Dax, in the specific work you're doing now, you're being called on to kind of gather this information and present it in a way that's going to provide insight. But I'm imagining often or occasionally you're presenting information that doesn't necessarily get warmly received, or is reluctantly embraced, if it's embraced at all. And talk a little bit about the challenges there, and how that involves having to use skills to present things both strategically and maybe diplomatically, or any number of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I appreciate that question. I think and then we're going to talk about this, there has to be some level of integrity around the work that you're doing, and it being in service of of a search for truth. And if you're true about that, and if you're consistent about that, I think you can then ask yourself and be generous in the ways in which you need to deliver that truth. Like, so when I'm delivering a report, I'm like, what is necessary and what's just like gratuitous?
Yeah.
What is like important and what is just like almost, going to tear people down and not actually going to provide nourish them in any way. So if I'm going to give you some critical feedback, I'm going to frame it in a way, hopefully, that you can use it. It is no use for me to just tell you something that's like, you can't, that is just bad about. Like that's, so I'm always thoughtful about the service of truth as the highest goal and aspiration, in that integrity I have, and that to be in alignment with that. But then once that's been covered, you can also then be generous to your audience, and recognize that, people can only take so much at a given time. And if your objective is to communicate with them, you have to be sensitive to that. It can't just be what you want and how you want it. Well, yeah, if you do that, then your sort of interaction with people is going to be a reflection of that. So generosity and empathy is always critical to how I do that kind of work, in the same way, in the way I do the work that I'm doing as a writer in other mediums.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you won't be surprised to hear that even today, but certainly throughout my conversations with 1455's programming, those words come up consistently, whether it's poets, novelists, journalists, sports writers, the foundation of truth and integrity, but the notion of empathy and curiosity driving effective and authentic narrative. And if you don't have those things, I think what you suffer is not having that credibility with your audience, so that they're not in a position to receive your message, whatever that message is, But I think if we take a step even further back,
Mhm.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Dax, about, because this also comes up. I think during this festival, it's going to come up. During my day-to-day, it comes up. But I think culturally, this is where we're at right now, kind of grappling when we talk about truth. I mean, I can't even say it anymore, right? In 2021, I can't really say truth without doing this,
Right.
because I think while a cynic or maybe an older person might say, it's always been that way, there's just more noise now. I think the last 5-10 years, abetted by social media, abetted by a very cynical, well, we won't name names, but some very cynical people in the media and organizations that thrive on manufacturing outrage and controversy that's not rooted in truth.
Yeah.
How do storytellers like you, who are specifically, we're not even just talking, I shouldn't say just novelists, but we're not talking, the stakes are a bit higher when we're talking about social change and disrupting paradigms that need disrupting. How are you finding, grappling with, we don't even have a common ground anymore. We can all agree to disagree that this is the truth, and now let's spin that truth. Truth is now this.
Yeah, man. I mean, again, to kind of just to kind of connect to even some of the work that I do, what I find is that where a lot of organizations even struggle is that there are not even baseline shared definitions of many different things. In particular, if I'm doing work with an organization and we're trying to do some diversity, equity, and inclusion related work, I often find people have very different definitions of even those words, and even have unclear definitions of them. So I think part of what I approach it from is that there do exist real and legitimate information and knowledge gaps, and I do have a sense and belief in many ways that part of what we have struggled with is in our ways in which we've chosen to educate people, even in the college experience. And I think is like the move away from a kind of education that is grounded in, and I think this can maybe be unpopular, but grounded in some kind of engagement with liberal arts, in the sense of sort of wrestling with story, wrestling with novel, wrestling, and it being a much more an orientation and a push towards purely vocational. This is in no way to diminish and minimize that, because I know that's incredibly vital and important to all of us, and I'm not minimizing it, but I do think there are analytical tools that one engages in and builds in an exercise that is fundamentally takes place in that environment, that kind of learning environment, a liberal art. And I think there's a huge loss, both because there's no real expectation in a college environment. You can just track yourself off of that. You can track yourself. And so you can leave there with a lot of education and an ability to apply a knowledge in a very specific way. But one of the things I remember learning when I studied English, and I was a philosophy and English major in undergrad, was I remember, and whether or not this is absolutely factually true, but one of my professors shared with us as a class one night. He's like, there's at that time at least, a proportion of CEOs and leaders who had liberal arts backgrounds was astronomical. And in many ways, that is because these are people who are developing minds of generalists and that ability to apply in a variety of spaces. So what I am observing and noticing is that there's a deficit in both the ability to engage critically and analytically with information. So while you have really smart people, like people who I think are, they're good at something technically, the ability to engage in something where there's a line of questioning about the source of this information, the extent to which this information can be checked for people. There's a lot of bypassing of that, partly because people never learned to do it.
Yeah, and listen, I'm gonna go right down the rabbit hole and say, okay, full agreement, and thank you for articulating that. I had a conversation earlier. I am an advocate on a lot of different levels. I think practically, spiritually, in terms of humanities and how important that degree can be for any youth.
I go for it. I don't shy from that anymore. I think at some point I did have some kind of like trepidation about articulating that, but now, no.
But what concerns me a bit is I feel like I had maybe pre-2016, I had my talking points, Dax, and I would say, in fact, when I would go speak at colleges, and they'd say, I was always the joker, right? Like, and here's this guy who got an English degree and got a master's, but is not a professor, is not a best-selling author, is this kind of, but that was my kind of shtick was exactly, if you've got the foundation, if you've been taught to communicate and think critically, you will be able to thrive in a variety of different, situations. But what concerns me now is I think that advantage, while I believe in it, and I certainly will continue to advocate for it, it's more important than it's ever been. But in terms of practical application, being able to think critically and communicate effectively, what difference does that make when we live in a world where people say, the sky looks green to me and you're not going to tell me otherwise?
Yeah, I know. That level of obstinacy though so we go back to empathy. Yeah. I will say that I think that we have on one side of the discourse, some elite liberal institutions that have not allowed a lot of people into them, that have historically, and that has left a lot of people feeling embittered and on the outside of those things, and therefore hell-bent on discrediting them. And for them, there are very legitimate reasons that they want to do that. Yeah. And I think so, but I think what those of us who either ascribe to that world, have been beneficiaries of that world, need to do a little bit more reflection on ourselves and how we participated in what can be felt like to others in sort of an exclusionary creation of culture. So that, we do have these very narrow numbers, a very narrow list of schools and institutions that are kind of the cultural arbiters, if you will. And if you are not part of that cabal, then you are not a legitimate X, Y, and Z. And I think that creates a lot of resentment in the social media landscape, is a place in which that resentment can actually live. And I think that resentment has some legitimacy in the case that we do say we're a democracy, and we do say the free market of ideas should be a place in which anybody should be able to participate, but that clearly is not the case. And it feels very much rigged against me. And so that is my, I don't even need to get into the right. I'm not even going to go there, because that's just a zany universe of incendiary, mishmash. But I think in the folks who identify with the left, the liberal wing, there's some work that needs to be done, and some reflection that needs to take place, and some recognition of how you also, by, in many ways, sort of distancing yourself from, and often looking down on, and having various notions about how people should live their lives. And that creates something for people. That creates some angst and some anger.
Yeah, and I think you've really hit on something that, again, I have to say comes up often. And I'm glad to repeat that, because I think it proves the point. The fact that these things come up often amongst people who think deeply about these issues means that we're really getting at the heart of the matter. Yeah. Another thing that concerns me, and I suspect you'll share my concern, is right now, I would say one of the the empathy barrier, tremendous issue. The curiosity barrier, tremendous issue. Social media, roller coaster, tremendous. But really, what I'm seeing now, trying to be as objective as possible, is the lack of discourse. And that is on the right. And to an extent, it's on the left. It's amplified via social media. But the rumblings of what I'm seeing going on right now, whether it's in my opinion, extremely cynical and manufactured blowback on critical race theory, which a lot of people don't even know what that means. So that whole thing is horseshit, as far as, like, we're not even having a debate about that. But also the cancel culture issue, and the notion of so-and-so stepped over a line, they're done.
They're done, yeah.
I find myself absolutely celebrating these mechanisms of social media and the internet that take away the traditional gatekeepers. So it isn't, the ability to communicate is not in the hands of a bunch of old white men. That is 100% for the better. Mm-hmm. But what concerns me now is, with everyone having a platform, somehow we're not having more discussions. Certain discussions are just being shut down. And I'm not asking you to answer that. I don't know if answer, but it's a weird phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been able to do is work with some colleges and universities around that very element of, like, what, call out, cancel, and there's a lot of, on these campuses, a lot of folks who've built their professional careers are in absolute fear right now, in absolute, just there's a sort of paralysis, because they're these young people who are unafraid and unwilling and very vocal about, and will notice and observe things. and there will be, whether they're inconsistencies or gaps or whatever, and they will speak on it in a way that is, I think, new for people who have been able to sort of be comfortable in their places of authority and not feel like they're being questioned around that. I think, though, that like this is, and in my work, I think a lot about generational challenges and the way the generations interact. And I think partly what, again, to go back to a point I think I was kind of getting at earlier, which is that there is like this, there are these generational tensions that exist. And some of it has to do, at least when it comes to folks feeling that they're being canceled, it has something to do with, to some extent, I want to make this come out correctly. Like there are people who have been feeling like they have been completely marginalized for a very long time. And when you feel marginalized and you find other people who feel similarly marginalized, and you're able to build and mobilize in some medium of voice that you, a louder voice, I do think that can also be intoxicating in and of itself. There can be a rush associated with the feeling of being able to tear at or rip down or under or just. Now there are people who are absolutely toxic and who are incredibly dangerous and have done very dangerous things. But what I struggle with, and I think is problematic, is to some extent the ways in which we do kind of cherry pick around people's histories and sort of kind of find the things that are going to be ammunition for our argument. It becomes like it's the sense that we've already kind of reached the conclusion, and we're going to just search for information that's going to confirm that about a person, and any information that might disconfirm that, we ignore it, or we find a way to minimize it or discredit that because we have connected to an agenda. So to me, there I think is a need and importance to people organizing who've been more marginalized and have not had voice, and being able to amplify issues and challenges and people who have been incredibly problematic, toxic, and maybe even worse. And I think there's like anything, people can go to an extreme with it. And I think I would like for folks to be able to understand when you might be operating in extreme. And I don't think we're at a place right now. There can be a self-righteousness on both ends of the spectrum, a self-righteousness at the progressive end and at the conservative end, where such. And also that's the last thing I'll say on this is, you talk about this lack of discourse. Some of it has to do with, there's a value that people place on being able, even when presented with information that disconfirms or challenges, being able to stand firm in a position in and of itself is actually the thing that's something is valued. So it's something to the extent that I think there's this unwillingness to change because that change might indicate weakness, that opening up oneself to a different way of seeing the world or different perspective would indicate that one is fallible or one didn't have it all figured out. And there's embarrassment and shame around that, rather than humility and a recognition that we're all on a learning journey. And of course you didn't have all the information. Why did you think you had all the information? Right. No one ever had it, but yet you've convinced yourself in many ways that you have all access to information, that your cause is the righteous cause, and therefore you can't give ground. People they cannot give ground because when you paint yourself into a corner, and which is, I think, a lot of folks have done in social media, because they built their following around this, they built their brand around it. So now you're trapped. You're trapped.
And you just opened something up for me, Dax, that I've never really kind of been able to articulate. But I think one of the reasons, aside from perhaps sanity, that so many artists struggle with being on top of the social media game. I mean, hopefully mostly because they're creating and they're interested in more kind of soulful activities. But I think the notion of a brand in and of itself, as it relates to like a marketing department and in a business setting, is totally antithetical to our aforementioned humanities training, where one is taught you don't know anything, and that's liberating.
Yeah.
You want to read accounts from Black women in the 19th century that we've never heard. Right. We want to read accounts from other worlds, other countries, other languages, because that helps make our own narrative more robust and rich. Mm-hmm. But as you point out, for a variety of pressures, mostly economical at the bottom line, people cling to their turf
Yeah.
and their paycheck depends on their ostensible expertise.
Yeah.
So you really hit on,
Yeah.
this resistance is not just laziness, although there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
It's not just turf
You got
claiming.
followers. You got followers now. You got followers. You
You've got to keep them. Yeah, you've painted yourself into that corner so that you can't get out, even if you want to admit it, because your own followers are finding.
And then there's also this sort of psychosocial emotion that you, the sort of rush that you've become really, really addicted to, which is the number of people who confirm something that you make when you make a really powerful statement, or you make some kind of, or whatever. There's a lot of clapping for that. There's a lot of applauding for that, and then people want it. That feels good.
Right.
Nice feeling. I feel it myself. How many?
Sure. We're all human.
Yeah, we're all human, and that's not the problem in terms of like desiring, but when it's like a dependency on that, in a sense that you can't therefore break away from that,
right?
And you can't challenge that paradigm, because if you do, it will ultimately discredit you entirely, so that you don't even have a platform anymore, and you get to start. Nobody wants to do that.
I'm gonna
in the social media space. I mean, we're talking about, there's particular mediums that allow for larger discourses, obviously, but I think the ones that we're talking about, particularly Twitter, they don't allow for nuance. They're not places for deep nuance. Of course, the text thread can allow for some element of that, but a lot of what we're trying to do in the work that we do, as narrative, art creators, storytellers, whatever else have you, requires some space. It requires some word count. It requires like some opportunity to like really suss this thing out. So I know personally, I find myself I just stay silent, because I don't think I'm like, the tone won't come out. And I think a lot of folks feel that way. And so you do have a lot of folks who I think are on these mediums, who are watching, who are consuming, but who are not actually engaging visibly, because they recognize to do so is incredibly dangerous and risky, right?
Yeah, and so a couple of things. Like my hope, I think, is that some of this temperature, I do think, is, if not cyclical, there's kind of this cultural obsession and the cancel. Some of the impulse behind people being canceled is certainly not a bad thing. If they're abominable actors in the public sphere that shouldn't have the advantages that they've had, let's interrogate that. But I guess I hope that we are not entering, because every time there's a new phenomenon in American history, that's like the new scare. Yeah. I'm not as concerned about suddenly, it's all cancel all the time. I think people will be bored with that. But I'm really fascinated, Dax, because I think partly because of your age, right? You talked about going into the academic world, the business world. I imagine that you're constantly, and in a very effective and positive way, straddling these two, kind of the baby boomers who are like, what do we do here? And the younger people, they're like, what do we do here? Neither of us have the voice that we want to have. I would imagine it takes a skill set that's really unique that probably wasn't necessary 20 years ago.
I mean, I call like my members people who we're like, I see myself as a bridge. I'm a bridge, and in that sense, like, I'm a kid who grew up with some of the analog, within the analog world, who became an adolescent as the world was becoming digital. So I'm not a native to certain things, but I have complete fluency and ability to navigate it. I don't look at it as a thing that is foreign or something that I can't navigate. It's part of my journey too. And yet I also know another experience. I think there's like these moments in people's lives where I might have this 10-year window where I can play this role of being sort of, and have a hand and ability to connect with multiple worlds. Maybe if I'm lucky, it might run a little bit longer, but generally speaking, that's kind of the window. And so you're right. Like I have, and I have empathy for both sides too, because for me, and I think about it in an organizational context, or even as a writer, it wasn't that long ago where I was someone trying to get published. It wasn't that long ago that I was someone who was in a job in an organizational context when I felt like I was living and operating in a very oppressive organizational environment. And I also can have and see and connect with the boomer who was socialized and raised in that kind of an environment and told all their lives that is the way we do it here. That is what it means to have a successful organization, successful this, successful that. And now it's being flipped on its head. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Everything that I've been told and have been doing and found successful is being challenged all of a sudden by these young people, these upstarts. I can actually sort of translate and when I try to do that, do it in an authentic way. Like I'm not just like going between, like not just like understand what they're saying, but trying to make some meaning for them. And to your point, the sick understand, so they can understand, like we operate inside of a context, inside of a history, inside of these sort of loops of time. And so this is what we're sort of seeing and feeling and experiencing. So if you can step outside of it just a little bit, you might not feel so emotionally triggered and sort of all of and sort of adrift because of it. You can maybe kind of gather some sort of understanding of it and then be able to use it to your benefit. And that's one of the things I think I have been able to do. And it's by dint of effort, like being a journalist, going out and doing, like when you're going out in the field, talking to all sorts of people, living through certain things, experiencing things, if you're lucky, you just develop a sense of, and an appreciation for a multitude of people's lenses and experiences and stories. And I think I can apply that in other contexts as well, as a person who's able to hear, appreciate, process, and then be able to communicate out to another group in a way that it can be heard, in a way that it doesn't sort of shut down the dialogue, but hopefully keeps it going.
I mean, that's such a mic drop moment right there, Dax. For me, you just really synthesized so much of what we've already talked about this weekend, and certainly what I obsess about. What makes effective storytelling? How does a storyteller develop craft? And that is such an, I think, underrated aspect, which is, and again, it's literally come up today, listening to veteran sports reporters, veteran political reporters, both of whom job is to get in front of people who, for a variety of reasons, don't want to open up and don't want to give anything other than cliched responses. Yeah. And these people's job is to get some news or get some nuggets of information and relay it in a way that's readable and enjoyable. Yeah. So there's all kinds of challenges. But I think what you're talking about is so critical, right, to any storytelling, whether we're talking about a lawyer or a professor or a novelist. Mm-hmm. If you are not in touch with the type of people you're writing about, or you're not writing with a sensitivity to what that audience needs, what you're ultimately doing is navel gazing. So, I'm the first person that's going to say, do what you got to do, create, get your story out. But if you hope to reach an audience and have a meaningful impact, you better pay attention to craft and the integrity of messaging. I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about catering to an audience. Actually, it's the opposite of that. But it's respecting the audience.
Totally. I think about, as well as preparing for this conversation, I started to think about a story I wrote last year for Washington Post magazine on the Newark Police Department. I had to become really involved in and have many, many different conversations with members. I met with chief of police, a bunch of people who were running this consent decree unit who were, because the city's under consent decree because of a sort of pervasive pattern of, ultimately violating the civil rights of its community. So they were already in a defensive space. And so here comes this guy who wants to write about them. And there's already an assumption that I'm going to try to do a hit piece. So part of what I have to do in that environment and then authentically say is that I'm going to model that I've done my homework. And so to me, the biggest compliment that I can get from somebody who I might even actually have some personally oppositional views to is like, you did your homework. You came in here prepared. You knew what you were talking about. What I find is that quite often is that, that they're, and so you could just think about your reporter that you talked to earlier today, is that many of these people who are in these positions that are very vulnerable, they're used to encountering people who come at them without information and underprepared. And that is what ticks them off. And that is what they don't want to talk to. They will talk to someone who they figure out, who they realize and respect and believe is actually trying to explore and do a story. Because believe it or not, they want to tell their story. That's right. They want to tell their story. They just don't want to have it butchered, hacked, and taken everything out of context. And so they have, and I understand that for me, again, empathy to even people I might have opposition. I'm talking to a chief of police and I know this person already expects that I'm going to come in here with an agenda. So how do I demonstrate and model to them that I'm here to listen? And I'm going to ask some hard questions, but I'm going to ask hard questions that at least give some recognition and appreciation to both the work that you do and also the facts as they are, right? I might have a different interpretation of that information, but I'm going to at least demonstrate and model to you that I did my work. And I think that's one of the, when we go back to thinking about what's happening in some of the sort of mediums we've been talking about, is that I look at that world and I think that what troubles me is that there is often a paucity and a dearth of deep research and an investigation and exploration of topic. People choose to kind of live at the surface level of these things. So to your point around critical race theory, like, it is of no surprise to me that people have gravitated towards it. It isn't easy. It has become an easy, it was made easy. It was turned into a very palpable, kind of almost like a sweet that you could just kind of take in and you can get a nice little rush off of, very easy. CRT, nice, easy thing. You can kind of latch onto that. That doesn't surprise me in any bit, because I think there's a lot of folks who've allowed themselves to be conditioned to, for lack of a better way to describe it, being lazy with with the ways in which they approach and deal with the world, and particularly parts of the world and people who are different than them.
Yeah, I think Dax, when we talk about, and we don't have the time. I mean, you and I will certainly talk about this over beers, but when we start talking about the political discourse, I think that's a message to our brothers and sisters on the left. Yes, we can and should point at the lunacy that we see on a daily basis on the other side of the aisle, and the blatant disregard of demonstrable reality. But being smug and being willing to dismiss entire regions of our country with I know exactly what makes them tick.
Yeah.
Again, if that might make you feel good for the sugar rush, and get some high fives on Twitter, but in terms of engagement, or if you really want to have a meaningful impact, you've already turned off that audience, entirely. So there's a lot, what you just uncovered, I think there's a lot to dig into as it relates to how does one go about telling a good story. Yeah. Some of it is just a simple matter of putting in the work and the time.
Putting in the work and the time. And it takes time sometimes to tell a really, that story I tell you about. I was working on that for the better part of 7 or 8 months, going back to the territory, got to get more information. Don't feel like I have a full grasp of what it is I'm trying to get at. That can't be done. Obviously you need support to make that happen, but that can't be done. And, unless both there's a desire for some level of truth, some sense of integrity around what I want to communicate to an audience. And for me, the last thing I would also add is that I respect people's time, meaning as a writer, I am really appreciative of people deciding to sit down with something I've written. And therefore I want to honor that. And I want to honor it with something that you will feel like it was worth your time. So I don't want to just give you some opinion about X, Y, and Z. There's enough opinions out there. Mm-hmm. I want to give you something that is nourishing and whole and actually can leave you feeling a bit more restored, even if it's hard to digest.
Well, I mean, props to that for sure. I think, it's funny because I catch myself with what I'm about to say. 90 times out of 100, I'm the guy saying the future keeps coming, adapt, change. We're living in the best times ever. I am an absolute advocate for get rid of the old gatekeepers, get rid of the old paradigms, respect what worked, respect our elders and those women before us. But change is coming, embrace it, learn, evolve. One thing I do find myself lamenting a little bit is, and you are the perfect antidote for this. I do think it's safe to say that there's less what we call long form journalism. And I've talked to a lot of writers, and I'll include myself. It's a conundrum that it's a tiny battle in a tiny room that doesn't impact anything, but it causes me a lot of angst. That I celebrate the fact that it's never been easier. There's never been less resistance to getting your story out there. Whether you start your blog, you go on social media, you self-publish a book, that's all to the good. Yeah. But one thing that I do kind of have nostalgia for is I do not want to go back to a world where there were 5 magazines and those were the arbiters of what we discuss. Yeah. But there was an opportunity for a more collective engagement because there was a professional narrative that set the tone. Yeah. And then we could debate and go off in our side rooms and our bars. And so I don't, and so that is a lamentation. But I still want to try to make lemonade and say, I think, of course, and I'm celebrating the fact, Dax, that you are basically you are what I'm talking about. You're the Terminator. You are from the future and the past, but you're doing a bit of both, right? You're conversant in, you know, the younger game, but you've got respect for the game and are able and willing to do long form journalism. I just think it's harder, and I think there's more frustration on the part of serious.
I'm trying to, you know, I have a couple of my editors are trying to drag me back in, you know, to get to some long form journalism again, and I'm so grateful that they want to do that. But you know, the reward for that is it's like it's not the most rewarding exercise, you know. It just really isn't. You feel like you can pour your heart into something and pour everything into something, and you know that you're communicating something that's profoundly important, not because necessarily you're writing it, but because it's a story that is either underreported or because it's never really been fully explored. And it can just sort of fall into the noise. And especially something that requires some deep engagement and can't just be sort of synthesized as simply. It can't be used as someone else's as a talking point, as an easy talking point for somebody in a dialogue. It gets lost. So I think that art, I hope, you know, and working with Type Investigations, that's the outfit that I'm connected with, and the work that I'm trying to do. And even I hope that happens, but I even tell you, it's hard for me to sometimes. It's hard for me, build the will, you know, so it's now becoming, maybe I'm doing some more podcast investigative work. Like that might be a medium in which to do it, because there's a recognition that it is a back and forth. That you need an audience. Mm-hmm. You're not doing this just so it can just for posterity, and yet there is value in that. Like I do believe there needs to be somebody who's maintaining the record of what happened here, you know. Like of what was going on, because there's somebody who comes back later on who's like, I just really need to understand what went on. I hear this opinion and that opinion, but can somebody give me a sense of like what was happening, you know? And so the record keepers are really important, and that may be the best that some of that investigative work can do right now is create a document or sets of documents that at least will hold some, you know, kernel of the truth that people in the future world will be able to look back on and say, this is what it is, or this is what I was looking for, or this is what I need right now to help me understand the missing pieces.
I've got a few reactions to that, all of them positive. I'd say first and foremost, Dax, long form journalism in general, but the kind of work you're doing, the word that I would use, that I'd stand by, it is optimistic, but I think it's the truth. That's the kind of work that stays, especially in an era where almost by design, our communication is evanescent. It's meant to be consumed, discarded, and you're already 50 tweets behind. Yeah. Long form journalism, if it's done with care and integrity, it stays. It will endure, and it will.
It's a monastic thing. It's like a monastic kind of like cult. You're not a cult, but it's like you're part of this. When you choose into that, you are choosing a kind of not a life of deprivation, but you're choosing a life with the recognition that you're gonna do something. You're doing something that is of value, perhaps beyond you. And I will say, what is encouraging is that you still do find policymakers and people who are reading some of these pieces, because that is often what they're looking for. So you might not hear the response from sort of broader, you know, audience, but there are people who are still like, I have people who pull me aside and say, man, that piece you wrote about the Port Authority all those years ago, man, I just want you to know, like that was, so that still matters. And for us, and I'm learning this myself, my wife knows this, finding value in really appreciating those people who go out of their way to tell you that, and not focusing so much on the number, but on the quality.
Yep.
On the sincerity, on the individual who goes out of their way and says, hey, thank you for that story. You connected with me.
I don't know if it was Malcolm Gladwell, who I'm usually allergic to, but I know it's like now it's almost like a cliche talking point, but I've read, I think, a very compelling anecdote that basically says for any artist, if you have 100 dedicated fans, that can sustain a career. Now, again, I don't know what the numbers are on that, if that plays out, but I think the point is, especially in 2021, especially for a writer, having people that are always going to read what you write will sustain you and certainly validate your work and effort a lot more than, dude, I got 50 likes. I mean, yeah, we all like that sugar buzz, but that sugar buzz wears off. And like I said, the kind of work you do stays. And by the way, just because we can and will continue to talk, I do want to give some love, and it kind of brings it full circle, right? A lot of I'm imagining that this type of work is not something you could have or would have written 10 years ago. It's a reflection of what you've learned and what you've seen and how you're pulling together a lot of these different threads in terms of what concerns you and how you might be able to write something that reaches an audience that really needs to read it.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that book, the book, that you're holding, of course, it's a month old today, as a matter of fact. Its birthday was a month old today. So I'm really happy to have this conversation with you. It's the first book I've written in 10 years. I wrote a flurry of books when I was in my 30s. And then I sort of decided that I needed to take some time away and I needed to do some other things. And I needed to allow, if this is the thing I really am supposed to do, if there's a story I'm really supposed to tell, it'll come back and it'll tell me. Like, we can say that in a cliched way, like if you're supposed to do something, let it go and come back to you. Like, I remember the moment when I said, I'm going to make this choice to go take my life in a different direction for a period of time. Let this thing find me again, if it needs to find me again. And that book that you pulled up is actually that. It is, something that found me. It was because both moment in time and because of life experiences and because of genuine and true relationships. And I think the evolving of a language to talk about something that is really, really difficult to talk about, and to a group of people, or to at least an identity in our culture that I think is, some of folks at least are actively looking for anchors, trying to get bearings, trying to understand where, like, I have, for the first time in my life, I'm talking to white men who are asking me, like, and saying to me, like, I don't know where I fit right now, Dax. I don't know what my role is right now. And there's some of folks who are defensive, some folks are resentful, some folks are just like searching, genuinely, like, and what I appreciate is that, what they're saying to me, and I'm fortunate enough to be someone who can be in conversation with these friends, is they're saying something about, an understanding that in many ways they have never had to have this kind of reckoning. They've never had to have this kind of thinking about their place in this society, at least as a generation. And so, I mean, the book, it comes and is born out of a recognition of what it's like to be an outsider. And it's writing to people who've maybe not had to experience it, at least at a societal level. I know people in their individual lives have all experienced some element of outsidedness, but to be part of a demographic and an identity group in our society that has held dominance, to now feel like, whether it's because of call out culture, cancel culture, or whatever it is, to now have to contend, like to literally contend in a way that others have not had to. I think it's a new place for a lot of my white friends to be in.
Yeah, and this kind of ties back to what we were saying earlier, which is on a real societal level. I mean, politics, culture, art. There's a lot of resistance. Some of it understandable.
Yeah.
Some of it inevitable.
Yeah.
And some of it, I think, right. There's going to be some pain, and I can speak to. I mean, I'm in a little bit of a unique situation because, I mean, I would never, ever call myself an artist, but I've always straddled that outsider, weirdo, don't identify with anyone line. But I also am very cognizant as a white straight male in 2021. I try to be cognizant of say less, listen more.
Mm-hmm.
If there's someone that can say it more convincingly or eloquently, or more importantly, is more appropriate to say something.
Or more, I would say, what do you say, more proximate to the thing? They might have more proximity to the thing that I might, that might be either that quote unquote lived experience. And I'm sorry for doing quote unquote around lived experience, but it is becoming a term that is being used inordinately right now in our culture.
Yeah.
But I think this idea of recognizing that people can have more proximity, and, again, to speak to journalism, journalism in many ways, and long form journalism in particular, has been a space owned by white men. It has been a space in which, who can write a 10,000 word piece? White men. You know, other people are not given the sort of embedded journalist opportunity or the sort of foreign correspondent role, or this sort of sexy jobs in the field have historically gone to white men, you know, and they've done, some of them, they've done amazing work. It's not to say that, but it is to say that what can happen therefore, and through that, and because if sort of one identity owns a space like that, is we do tend to get certain perspectives about a variety of things that miss a lot of people. And people like myself, I read pieces that I love, whether it's in Harper's or Atlantic, whatever. And I'm like, you know, I can see, I read them, and I have read them throughout my life. And I've thought at different points, like there's a certain luxury not to have to think about X in this moment right here, or there's a question that I might have asked differently, or might have seen, but it's being presented as fact, presented as sort of uncontested information. And that has a lot to do with the lens of the person who's telling that story. And right now, what we're seeing is that new people are trying to get in to the game and trying to do this work around sort of storytelling in this very formal sense we call long form journalism. And, you know, I think it's a great thing. We need it. And there's a place for everybody. Like I always say, like my project, if there's a project that I'm up to with this book, it is fundamentally rooted in a desire for us to find a way to be in this place, in this country, in this world together, and in a way that doesn't require you to be superior and me to be inferior. That's what I'm up to but I'm not trying to create a world in which now I got to be on top. And like, that is not a project that I have an interest in, because I don't think that's not an end game. It's not a thing that I desire. I desire for us to have a bit more humility, a bit more sort of collective empathy, and a bit more just recognition that, you know, we have built a society in many ways that has afforded opportunities for certain people and not afforded opportunities for others. And that's just a fact. You know, it's just a fact. And so I'm kind of rambling here, but this conversation we've had around sort of the long form and the sort of work and who gets to present their work and whose work is taken seriously, it really means a lot to me, because, you know, I spent a long time, my 20s and 30s, you know, in those sort of early aughts and into the early, when we weren't having these conversations, I was that journalist who couldn't get into any of these. I couldn't get the freelance out. I still had to self-publish a bit sometimes because my work was not taken seriously. It was not being given the same opportunities as some of my counterparts. As much as I was putting in the work, people were not seeing it. So I did have some feelings about that. But that doesn't mean therefore, what I'm not trying to do is exert those feelings in a form as a way to kind of get back at or take vengeance upon. That's not the point here.
Right.
I actually don't want anybody to feel that.
Right. Well, I didn't feel any pressure to tie everything together, but I think what you just said, where my mind goes, Dax, is, and again, forgive me, but I have to mention that this is a recurring theme across a lot of different genres and concerns, which is whether it's talking about fellow novelists lifting each other up in this notion of community, whether it's talking about whether we want to call it critical race theory or just academic - cultural controversy conversations. I think the key thing that is lacking and that we can do more to stimulate, because the facts bear out that this works, is more people understand that generosity is not only a smart but very practical philosophy. And so when writers aren't feeling, and I'm talking mostly about established writers, the black, white, and gatekeeping, that is well said, and I'm not debating that at all. The notion of writers just being competitive and like, this is my space, and, you know, if I lift that author up, that's going to take some of my publicity away. The people that figure out, no, the more we lift, the more awareness we bring to our tribe. And similarly, whether it's a white liberal male, understanding no one's taking my place. We're opening the tent wider. And by the way, if you believe in America and you say you're a patriot, what is threatening about saying we are a diverse, multicultural, beautiful melting pot? And that's strength. But we are up against people that look at that as, well, if someone gets more, then I get less. And I think that that's a real problem that we're facing right now. But I remain optimistic that I think with good storytelling, there are ways to get people to understand what's the problem here. You've been enculturated to think that's a threat. It's not a threat.
Yeah. Yeah. Good storytelling. I think one of the things I wanted to make sure I didn't forget was that, good storytelling for me is leads with voice, both of the writer and of the people the writer decides to sort of either fictionally create or deploy in service of the story that they're looking to tell. There's just nothing, there's really good narrative pieces that exist in that great paragraph, real crafted sentence, all that stuff. But when someone is able to, and a writer is able to capture a voice, a person's expression of something, and it's, to me, in order, whether it's a piece of dialogue or whether it's just a state, to me, that is like, that's why I love to start pieces with, with voice. I love to find a character that's going to help drive a story and to me, that's a very generous, because that's me recognizing that my voice isn't going to do it. My job actually as storyteller is to get out of the way of this. Actually, it is not to dominate this thing. It is not to say, look what Dax did here. It's to actually seed the space, create the territory, give the context, and give the contours and the space for that thing to come out, for you to hear that person's voice, that woman's voice, that level of generosity, that level of, so what you said around writers lifting each other up, I think it's the lifting up is happening in the work itself. It's not just across the people who are creating it. It's with the people that you are engaging with to tell the story, and also hoping that, and then of course in the audience that you're looking to engage with the story. So I appreciate that, because I will say, and I know we're running out of time, that is something that I've struggled with, is that I feel like when you live in a market economy, in a market society the way we do, it turns everything into a commodity. Creativity becomes a commodity. Storytelling, of course, becomes a commodity, but who becomes a pawn in that, or becomes a very useful part of that, is writers or creatives, because we're already, as writers, we're already kind of, at least in this day and age, we're already kind of not part of the A-list. Like, that's Hollywood. Like, we're already sort of in this sort of secondary role as far as culture is concerned. So, we're sort of hanging on and always trying to, and therefore jockeying for some kind of positionality, some kind of visibility. And I get that. So again, I'm empathetic to that and understand that. But again, understanding, like, it's that attitude, that approach, it doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't end well.
I don't think it ends well for the individual, which has been my kind of mantra these last couple of years, talking to more and more writers and seeing the ones, what's been interesting to me is even the ones that have achieved some level of success, or ones that have achieved a level of success that in my estimation, most writers would give a limb to trade places with. And you see this profound unhappiness. And I think, that's a whole separate conversation, right? That I'd love to have with you.
Yeah, I know we can't talk about it, but I mean, one of the things I've tried to really be grateful to is, in this last month, just having a new book out, the fact that I've been able to have numerous conversations about my work. I've been able to have some reviews, some interviews. Like, these are things that I know many writers don't get an opportunity to experience. And so I've had to, and my wife and my partner, she's caught me in these moments where I'm doing the comparative thing. Like, but that person over there got that review. I want to, like, stop that. Like, just don't do that to yourself, because there is no end to that cycle.
That's right.
There is no end to that cycle. There'll
right.
always be another thing. So I'm really just grateful for this conversation. I'm grateful for you saying you want to have a conversation like this with me. So all I want to do is make sure that I demonstrate and model to this audience, whoever is listening, whoever's watching, like, this is a writer who is really fought to be in a place like this right now, to have this kind of conversation. It was not a given that I would be in a space where I could talk about my work. And I am so grateful as a writer to have, been able to stay at it long enough that I'm able to sort of sit in a space of having had completed some work that I'm proud of, and be able to talk about it and to think about it and reflect on it. This is a gift. Thank you for creating this space, my friend.
Well, listen, thank you for being, able and willing. And listen, Dax, I'll tell you, I'm certain that people that are watching this can learn a lot. I've learned a lot. It's inspiring to me to always be reminded, right, that there are no shortcuts. there's very seldom fast success, or it's fleeting. So I say all the time in all these conversations, you've got to do the work. You've got to be fulfilled by the work. You've got to do it with integrity. You've got to do it with respect for the audience, but you've got to be grateful for the platform you have. And, if that's what drives you, you're probably on the right track. And if there are other factors playing in, I'm not gonna tell anyone how to live, but you're probably going to always be disappointed. So to me, Dax, you are on many levels a role model. You're of the old school. You're very comfortable in the new, paradigm. You're doing meaningful work. That, by the way, let me remind you, folks. I think it's August 24th. We'll put this on the website.
24th. That's right.
Yeah, August 24th. Dax and I will be going deep on this book, and I can't wait. But listen, I told you, right? Like, high five.
We got this.
I said, you know what? We don't even need to prepare. We'll go in and talk. But that being said, we did prepare. I'm profoundly grateful. It's wonderful to talk to you. But more importantly, thank you for elevating the proceedings. You're doing us a great service by dropping some knowledge here.
That's right, man. Thank you so much. I want to give you some powerful spirit for these next 2 days. You've been putting in your work. Your teams are putting the work. This is amazing. Congratulations. Keep going. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Dax. And we will talk to you literally very soon.
I know. All right. Be well.
All right, my friend.
Okay.
And folks, thank you for tuning in tonight. We will see you bright and early tomorrow. And then it's go time for another 48 hours. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back.
All right.